dum da dum dum da dum dum da dum 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 da dum dum da dum dum. Ooh. Now, if you've made it past that, you'll be pleased to know that one of my earliest TV watching memories was getting very upset when Rose Tyler was sucked into the parallel dimension and could no longer travel in space and time with the Doctor. Now, of course, I am talking about Doctor Who, the long-running BBC science fiction drama, and from then I've been a fan through the incredible highs and the very low lows of the show. So much so that during my master's degree I went back and watched as much of classic Doctor Who that I could come across, and this was long before it was all available on BBC iPlayer, so it was quite the endeavour of delving the internet. But one of the main conceits of the show, and the reason it has continued to run in one long continuity, is the ability of the central character, the Doctor, to regenerate when hurt, allowing for an in-universe explanation for the occasional recasting of the role with actors that have little in common with one another. And that got me thinking, as I often do, this power of regeneration and the ability to change into different versions of the very same thing reminded me of stem cells, special cells within each of us that, given the right signals, can become every single cell type that makes us up. Thus, in this lecture from Science After Hours, we shall attempt to answer the question, is the Doctor just one big sentient stem cell? Doctor Who began in 1963 and was the brainchild of fairly new BBC employee Sidney Newman, who was a big fan of science fiction and saw a gap in the Saturday night schedule for something new, something which could grab some prime time attention. The idea of science fiction, though, was not new for the BBC, as internal reports a year earlier in 1962 had floated the idea of a time travel show. So Sidney got together with a working group consisting of himself, of course, head of the script department Donald Wilson, script editors Alice Frick and John Braburn, and BBC staff writer Cecil Webber. It is this group of people who hashed out the broad strokes of what is recognisably Doctor Who today, an individual who travels time and space in a somewhat unreliable machine that's bigger on the inside than it is on the outside, with a lead character of Doctor Who being someone who finds solutions through science, both applied and theoretical. Finding those solutions through science was going to go hand in hand with other educational aspects of the show, with this special time-travelling machine changing shape to fit into the historical areas that would be the background of each and every episode. Doctor Who was much less about space and aliens and more about looking into the past and teaching people things through drama. But as the ideas developed and things became more concrete, the educational aspects were withdrawn, and the idea of a time machine changing shape was also scrapped for budgetary reasons. And much like regeneration, which I promise I will get onto shortly, was written into the show as a feature of the time machine, now called the TARDIS, that was damaged, keeping it in the now iconic 1960s police box that we all know and love. Whilst the direct educational impact of the show was lessened, it was still important to Sidney Newman, writing in a memo to production staff that whilst he didn't want the show to come off as condescending, it should be an educational experience, stating that the show should have drama based upon and stemming from factual material and scientific phenomena with actual social history of past and future. This is something the show very much continues to strive for today, over 60 years later, sometimes with great effect, such as Vincent and the Doctor, and sometimes terribly, looking at you, Orphan 55. But Doctor Who needed a face, and that honour went to William Hartnell, the then 55-year-old character actor, mostly known for playing military roles and considerably tougher characters that Hartnell himself described as bastards. Yet the now producer of the show, Verity Lambert, had seen his performance in the sporting drama This Sporting Life and noted his more sensitive side, and this was her inspiration for offering him the part. Hartnell himself was reluctant to play the role. As I just mentioned, it was certainly not the sort of character he would normally embody, but it was his grandchildren that ultimately convinced him to become the Doctor, the role he is now arguably most remembered for. but as the show progressed, Hartnell's health began to deteriorate, and this can be seen in some of those later serials where he struggles to deliver the lines he is given, and thus the idea of recasting and writing it into the show as one of the Doctor's alien abilities was thought up by then story editor Jerry Davis. And in the serial The 10th Planet, the first Doctor became the second, with Patrick Troughton taking on the role. And the rest, as they say, is history. We've now had 15 canonical Doctors, played by 14 different actors, with other versions of the character both appearing in the main show, such as John Hurt's War Doctor, comic relief comedy specials, and unique non-alien takes on the character, such as a series of TV movies. But if you've made it this far, you're probably thinking, what on earth could an alien that can change its appearance have anything to do with stem cells? Or you're shouting at the screen, what even is a stem cell, you meandering fool? Or you can leave such shouting in the comments below, and whilst you're there, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell, or whatever it is that YouTube video makers are supposed to say in 2026. And if it isn't 2026, just insert whatever it is that content creators say in this here section as you're listening to it. But enough of that, and back to the science. Stem cells are very, very special. If you've ever listened to me talk about science outside of these video lectures, you would know that I love a macrophage, but stem cells are in a league of their own. Stem cells are a class of cell, and we'll get into their more specific minutiae momentarily, that can self-renew and can differentiate themselves into multiple cell lineages. Basically, these cells can regenerate and become something totally different. But this is biology we're talking about today, as it'd be far too simple for there to just be one type of stem cell, the stem cell. And indeed, that is not the case, with different classes of stem cells being based on their ability to differentiate, otherwise known as their potency. At the very top of the pile, we have the totipotent stem cell, the stem cell present at the earliest stages of embryonic development after fertilization. The fact that they are present exclusively at this stage of life infers their function, and it is from these highly potent cell type that an entire embryo, as well as extra embryonic structures, that's the supportive tissues like the placenta, that are lost once the offspring is born and therefore are technically not part of the individual, are produced. After a few rounds of cell division, within the first week post-fertilization at the very least, the egg is now considered a blastocyst, and it's within the blastocyst that the totipotency is lost and replaced by pluripotent stem cells, the second most potent type of stem cell. Pluripotent stem cells are just like totipotent stem cells in the fact that they have the capacity to differentiate into any cell type within the developing embryo. The reason they are considered less potent is for that exact reason. They can only differentiate to cells within the embryo, so no placental cells and whatnot coming from this source. Biologically, of course, this continues to make sense. If you're a week-old fertilized embryo with nothing even close to a recognizable human existing yet, with all of our cellular systems needing to be created from somewhere, these pluripotent stem cells are that somewhere, themselves differentiating into less potent forms of stem cell that will go on to develop into the cells that make us up. When people think of embryonic stem cells that are used in science, they're most often these pluripotent stem cells rather than totipotent, primarily due to the ease of working with them. But I do say ease as a very much relative term, as working with pluripotent stem cell lines such as iPSCs is extremely difficult, stressful, and time consuming. In fact, one could argue that it's easier to have a child than grow iPSCs, but that's by the by. Down from pluripotent stem cells, we get multipotent stem cells, such as the hematopoietic stem cell, and these can develop into several types of the same class as cell. So the hematopoietic stem cell develops into several types of blood cells. These then give rise to oligopotent cells, such as the myeloid progenitor cell, which will differentiate into classes of white blood cells specifically, but not red. And this is where my beloved macrophages arise. Lastly, we have the unipotent stem cells, cells that cannot differentiate into other cell types but will continue to divide and produce new cells. Probably the example that we are most familiar with in our day-to-day lives is the epidermal stem cell, a unipotent stem cell that lies at the basal layer of the epidermis, that's the bottom layer of the skin, that continue to grow and divide to replace the many skin cells that we lose on a daily basis. Before finishing up by returning to our favourite Time Lord in a blue box, if you're anything like me, your neurons are probably making you think something along the lines of, well, that's great and all, but why lose the totipotent ability? Surely having such cells as a full human would be pretty useful. And to be honest, it probably would be, but as the embryo develops and more subclasses of cell develop, intracellular signals start to change, and these already differentiated cells, as you might imagine, start to dominate, and they want more and more cells just like them to be able to create the structures they were ultimately destined for. You don't want a layer of endothelium, for example, where in the middle of it are a bunch of cells that, given the right signal, could become a neuron. Thus, all these specialized signals push those stem cells away from that pluripotent life into one that's much more structured. But it's also been suggested by some researchers that these signals are not just down to direct messages in the form of cytokines from neighbours, but also the physical presence of these neighbours changes the mechano and osmotic pressure within the stem cells, which then goes on to change the expression pattern of the gene CBX2, which is involved in the compaction of chromatin, which is already a compact complex of DNA and proteins. This reduction in CBX2 expression, at least in this research article, then led to an increase in the rate of differentiation of the cells and therefore a loss of potency. So it's clear that there is much we don't understand about stem cells, just like there's much we don't understand about the Doctor and his fellow Time Lords. But after spending all this time researching stem cells, to be honest, I don't think Time Lords have more totipotent stem cells than the rest of us, but perhaps all of their cells maintain some degree of oligopotency, allowing the cells to change into something new upon the right signal. That signal, of course, being regeneration energy. Thank you for listening.